Hey there, it's Trisha Lynn, and welcome to Crime 11, a former cop's true crime corner of the world. There's been a little bit of a hiatus, but we do plan to start uploading more regularly from this point on, ideally at least once a week, so hang in there if this kind of thing floats your boat. The incident I'm about to delve into occurred quite a while ago, in the later part of the 1980s. As we know, the 80s was a magical decade, not only renowned for big hair, bold makeup, and shoulder pads, unfortunately, but also for one of the greatest achievements of modern times. Millennials, like myself. Speaking of myself, hello again. I'm switching things up a bit because while my previous episodes were very media intensive with pictures and clippings and so forth, in this instance, I really don't have a lot of that to present, so you're stuck with my big head for the most part. In any case, this incident is out of Chicago, Illinois, and was fictionalized in a movie you may be familiar with called Candyman. Not the recent reboot or the sequel or whatever you want to call the latest release, but the original film from 1992. The main character in that movie is a woman named Helen, who's a grad student co-authoring a thesis examining what was thought to be a mythical figure named Candyman. He's a notorious urban legend among the residents of the infamous Chicago housing project, Cabrini Green. And near the beginning of the movie, Helen is researching the unsolved murder in a Cabrini Green building of a woman named Ruthie Jean. She was found slashed to death in her apartment by a mystery attacker who was said to have entered through the bathroom mirror, and the residents attribute her death to Candyman. That's the movie version, but in reality, Ruthie Jean was actually a woman named Ruthie Mae McCoy to be exact, and she wasn't murdered by Candyman or any other ghost, nor did her incident occur at Cabrini Green. It actually took place at another low-income public housing development called ABLA, A-B-L-A. ABLA was an acronym based on the names of 4 individual low-income housing projects located on the city's west side and operated by the Chicago Housing Authority. As of the early part of 1987, Ruthie Mae was 52, and she had been living there since 1983 when she got flooded out of a basement apartment. The project she lived in was called the Grace Abbott Homes, and it was a cluster of 7 15-story high-rises. When she applied to the Chicago Housing Authority, she specifically requested not to be placed in a high-rise, or at least to be on a lower floor if need be. Overall, she would have preferred a row home, but ultimately she was offered a unit on the 11th floor in a Grace Abbott Tower. She was of limited financial means due to mental health issues that had plagued her since her 20s and made her incapable of being consistently employed, so she was dependent on disability assistance. She only got about $156 a month, and the rent at Grace Abbott was $46 for her, so with affordability being a major factor, she reluctantly moved to 1440 West 13th Street, apartment number 1109. Living conditions there were very uncomfortable, to say the least, for several reasons. For one, ABLA was notorious for violence, drugs, and other assorted criminality, and it was actually even more dangerous than Cabrini Green. Serious violence occurred there at a rate more than double that of the general citywide crime rate. There was an infamous drug organization that ruled the roost and didn't hesitate to use violence against competitors or anyone who ran their mouth or otherwise crossed them. Secondly, it was common for vacant apartments to be used by the drug dealers or any other nefarious characters for illicit activities. Or even if an apartment wasn't officially vacated, illegal sublets were a regular practice where tenants would move but not notify CHA and then let other people have use of the apartments when they were gone. Thirdly, the grounds were poorly maintained and regularly neglected. The elevators were often out of service, which sometimes hindered law enforcement response capabilities, and the stairwells had no windows in them and thus no natural light whatsoever. So when the light bulbs burned out or were stolen by tenants, as they sometimes were, the steps were shrouded in darkness, which was pretty sinister looking, at least. So there was a litany of reasons why a lot of the residents there didn't feel safe. Ruthie Mae herself suffered from a mild form of schizophrenia with paranoid tendencies, but clearly her living environment gave her perfectly legit reasons to be paranoid. She had a daughter named Bernita who lived with her there for the first 2 years, along with Bernita's 2 children and boyfriend, but Ruthie Mae didn't care for the boyfriend and some drama eventually ensued, causing Bernita and her family to move and leaving Ruthie Mae alone in the apartment. She absolutely hated living by herself and was constantly scared of being a victim of a robbery or burglary. As a result, she was obsessed with locks and security. She had her locks changed by the CHA at least twice in her tenure there and had put in multiple requests to be moved to a lower floor or one of the row houses, but was denied every time. To other residents, Ruthie Mae was known as Miss May and had a little bit of a reputation for being slightly off, per se. She dressed shabbily sometimes and would randomly curse at strangers on occasion, and she could be on the confrontational side towards people who grated her nerves. In the past, she had threatened people with sticks for playing music too loud, and the police had to intervene here and there in some of those altercations, but generally she was harmless and stayed to herself. By the spring of 1987, she had been regularly attending an outpatient psychiatric clinic that she went to 3 times a week, and the consistent treatment resulted in notable improvements to her mental health and her physical upkeep. She began studying for her GED even. She was well liked at the center and took on a sort of motherly mentor role to the younger females there. It was also appearing like there was some tangible hope for her to escape from the tiresome predicament of living life at the Abbott homes. She had been approved for supplemental security income in recent months, which doubled her monthly disability payments. That February, she had gotten a lump sum of back payments and was planning on saving up to move to a private apartment in the not-so-distant future. But then came the night of April 22nd, 1987. Around 8:45 p.m., Ruthie Mae called 911 in a panic, making bizarre remarks about someone throwing down a cabinet and trying to come through her bathroom. The call taker wasn't quite sure what she was getting at, so they dispatched a patrol unit at 8:47 to a disturbance with a neighbor complaint. At 9:02, with no officers on scene yet, 911 got another call for apartment 1109. The caller, not Ruthie Mae, reported hearing a gunshot as she was walking past. 2 minutes later, at 9:04, yet another call came in from another third party reporting gunshots and hollering in apartment 1109. Police arrived on scene at 9:10, which was 25 minutes after Ruthie Mae's initial call and 8 minutes after the first gunshot call. They knocked on the door and no one answered, so they asked dispatch to call the apartment. They heard the phone ringing, but no one answered that either. They canvassed around the floor, asking neighbors if they had heard anything out of sorts, but nobody had. They went to the administrative office and got the key, but it didn't fit the lock. And for some odd reason, the buck stopped there, and they decided not to make any other further attempts at entry or contact and left at 9:48. The next evening, on April 23rd, a neighbor friend of Ruthie Mae's named Deborah called 911 because Ruthie Mae would often stop by in her travels to and from the outpatient center, but she didn't show up that day. Deborah was worried because of that, and with her knowledge of knowing that the police had been at Ruthie Mae's apartment the night before. Police and CHA security responded and again failed to get an answer at the door. The CHA discouraged the door from being broken into because they were worried about getting sued. So once again, everyone just kind of threw their hands up and left. The next afternoon, April 24th, the ever-persistent Deborah went to the administrative office and expressed her concerns about Ruthie Mae again. At this point, let's say we're about 40 hours, give or take, from the last time anyone had last heard from Ruthie Mae, which is when she called the police. Something finally clicked, and they went to Ruthie Mae's and 4th Century, where they discovered her dead on her bedroom floor. She had been shot 4 times in her shoulder, her chest, her stomach, and her leg. The fatal wound was the one to the chest that severed her pulmonary vein and resulted in fatal internal bleeding. So that was the real-life death of Ruthie Mae, which in a loose sense was the basis for the Ruthie Jean murder in Candyman. Obviously, the movie blended fictional elements in its depiction, but the bathroom cabinet aspect was actually based on a very unsettling reality. Another plot point in the movie concerned a construction quirk of sorts in the Cabrini Green projects, where removing the bathroom's medicine cabinet from the wall of one unit would put you face to face with the back of the adjoining unit's cabinet. And if you pushed that cabinet from your side and knocked it off the wall, then that created an access point to that unit that someone could crawl through and vice versa. As it turns out, that was actually a real thing in the Grace Abbott homes where Ruthie Mae lived. And that helps to frame her remarks to 911 about someone coming in through the bathroom with some pertinent context. The two apartments on either end of every floor were purposely constructed like that for easy access to pipes behind the walls for maintenance issues. So 4 units on each floor were affected. It was designed with good intentions in mind, of course, but once it was discovered by unsavory characters, it became a serious safety issue for many people living in Abla, being as there was a couple of feet of space behind the wall that a person could fit into. And from there, they could not only potentially access the adjacent apartment on the same floor, but they could also move vertically and travel between levels to vulnerable apartments on other floors. Break-ins via that MO have been going on in the Abla projects for some time preceding Ruthie Mae's murder, at least a year and a half prior to the extent where residents would put furniture in front of their bathroom doors at night or try to tie them closed with rope before going to bed. You can only imagine how unsettling and even mentally and emotionally taxing it must have been to have to resort to extraordinary measures like that night after night to try to feel safe in your own home. Personally, I would probably just never be able to get to sleep living like that. But think about that particularly with someone like Ruthie Mae in mind. You have this elderly, mentally compromised woman who lived on her own and was uneasy about living there from the get-go. It's actually just really sad to think about how she probably spent a lot of her time feeling insecure in her living environment and fearing the very thing that ultimately did come to pass for her. The police stepped up to the plate pretty quickly, and on the same day that Ruthie Mae's body was discovered, they ended up bringing in a guy named Tim Brown. Tim Brown didn't live at the Grace Abbott homes, but he had use of apartment 1108 on a regular basis. 1108 was the apartment next to Ruthie Mae's. Brown was friends with the leaseholder of 1108, who had moved elsewhere and gave him a key, like we previously talked about, and he used the apartment to party with friends and to crash in from time to time. At first, he claimed he hadn't been at 1108 at all on the day of Ruthie Mae's murder. He said he'd been with a friend named Corey Flanoy and that they had hung out and partied elsewhere and spent the night at a friend's. Yet in a separate interview, Corey Flanoy said they spent the night at a motel. The police attacked that inconsistency, and then Brown amended his account to say that he and Flanoy actually had been in 1108 for most of that day. He got there at 1 and Flanoy came around 3. Around 8, men by the names of John Hondras, Edward Turner, and Ronald Coleman showed up. There were other assorted males and females there. It was like a small mixed group kind of thing, and they all sat around listening to music, drinking, and smoking weed. Around 11:30, Ronald Coleman took John Hondras into the bathroom and showed him how the adjacent apartment, which was 1109, Ruthie Mae's, could be entered through the void behind the medicine cabinet. Coleman and Flanoy eventually left, and then John Hondras and Edward Turner went into the bathroom and pulled the medicine cabinet off where they could see straight into Ruthie Mae's apartment because there was no medicine cabinet up on her side apparently. Brown warned Hondras that an old lady lived there, but Hondras didn't think anyone was home and climbed through. But Ruthie Mae was home because she was heard calling out who's there. Hondras went deeper into her apartment and left out its door and then knocked on the door of 1108 and asked Brown to give him his jacket. He put it over his head and went back into Ruthie Mae's apartment. Brown went into the bathroom of 1108 and saw Turner go through the medicine cabinet next. Then he heard Turner yell, "Get down," and several gunshots. 5 to 10 minutes later, Hondras and Turner came out of Ruthie Mae's, one with a rocking chair and one with the TV, and they disappeared. 2 to 3 hours later, they went back and cleaned up and collected the shell casings. Now, if you notice, Brown said that Ruthie Mae's apartment was broken into around 11:30, but Ruthie Mae pointedly called the police at 8:45. In all fairness, that could be easily a legit mistake. Presumably, he was sitting around getting drunk and high with everyone else and could have easily lost track of time. I'd hazard a guess that neither he nor the majority of that group did many productive things with their time, so there was probably not much need or interest in keeping track of it on the regular. So it's not hard to envision him being unsure about what time anything happened. But over and above his word itself, the police gathered some other corroborative statements and evidence and arrested Edward Turner the next day and then got John Hondras about 2 weeks later. The case didn't get to trial until March of 1990, 2 years and 11-ish months later. They were tried separately but simultaneously. Hondras took a bench trial and Turner went with a jury trial. Tim Brown got put on a stand as pretty much the key witness against them both and was expected to recount what he told authorities almost 3 years prior. Hondras and Turner broke into the apartment. He heard gunshots from the apartment, and he saw them leaving with property from the apartment. But much to the chagrin of the prosecution, he flipped the script a bit. He maintained that Ronald Coleman and John Hondras went into the bathroom of 1108 together, but where he had previously stated that Coleman only showed Hondras the medicine cabinet technique and then left before the break-in occurred, at trial he testified that neither of them came out of the bathroom after they went in, and then he heard gunshots. He went on to say that Turner, who 3 years before he alleged was the second culprit, was actually on the couch with him in 1108 the whole time while Hondras and Coleman were in Ruthie Mae's, and that after the gunshots were heard, he, Turner, and everyone else in 1108 got out of Dodge and ran down to the lobby. Obviously, the prosecution called him out about the glaring conflicts between his court testimony and his 1987 statement, and he proceeded to weave a tale about how the police were mean to him and allegedly put their hands on him and pretty much strong-armed him into implicating Turner. It should be noted, given this drastic 180 on Brown's part, that he, having continued on his yellow brick criminal road in the couple of years between the murder and the trial, had done another stint in jail. And he had been housed in the same unit as Turner was when Turner was there for his pretrial detention in this matter. That fact was brought out in court. So that really does call to mind the question of whether there's a possibility that their proximity to each other in jail, when one is a witness against the other in a murder case of all things, may have led to some type of influence on Brown in one way or another to renege on fingering Turner. Who knows? Either way, even the judge noted that Brown was lying, and he didn't beat around the bush about it. He wrote in his notes, "This is a total liar." Good call. So that was a bit of a fiasco, but there was assorted testimony from other people that helped to paint a more vivid picture of what happened. Sonia Moore was a girl Turner was interested in at the time of the incident, and she testified that at 10:30 that night, Turner came to her apartment and bragged about shooting somebody. But later in the conversation, he claimed he had only been kidding. Lynette Fitch was Brown's girlfriend in 1987. She testified that Hondras and Turner came to her door at 2 a.m. on April 23rd, which was about 5 hours post-murder, with a rocking chair and a TV. And remember, that's exactly what Brown said they came out of Ruthie Mae's apartment with. They wanted Lynette to stash the stuff in her apartment, but she pretty much told them to kick rocks and suggested they try Sonia Moore. Sonia Moore did say that there was a knock on her door in the middle of the night and she heard Turner calling her name, but she didn't bother answering. Good for her. Viola Archibald was Hondras' girlfriend in 1987. She testified that Hondras and Turner came to her apartment at 3:30 a.m. on April 23rd with a rocking chair and a TV. Lo and behold, she let them leave the stuff there. The police did eventually recover those items and positively identified them as Ruthie Mae's property. Turner testified before his jury in his own defense. He said he was in 1108 when he heard several gunshots next door. He ran down to the lobby and Hondras came down alone 30 minutes later. Turner claimed he had only been trying to brag to Sonia when he said he shot someone, but he had been lying. He liked her and was trying to impress her. Well, some men go the traditional sending flowers route, and some men, I guess, try their hands with, "Hey, look at me, I kill old ladies." But it seems that Sonia didn't exactly go googly-eyed over that, so he read the room, so to speak, and sheepishly pulled back from it, I guess. But it remained that either he didn't shoot Ruthie Mae and lied to Sonia and said he did, or he really did shoot her, told Sonia, and failed to get the reaction he expected, so then he lied and said he didn't. So he's a liar either way. But this is when we might want to call our attention back to the original recounting of events that Brown told the police. He specifically stated that Turner went into Ruthie Mae's apartment second, and that's when he heard him yell, "Get down," and then the gunshots. That highly suggests that it was Turner who was the shooter. But continuing with Turner's questionable testimony, he said that at 2 a.m. he went back to the hallway of 1108/1109 and saw a TV sitting outside and someone named Belder holding a rocking chair. This Belder person asked for help with carrying either item. Turner noticed 1109's door ajar, took a peek in, and saw a body in the bedroom. But no big deal, he walked back out and picked up the TV. Then Hondros came out of 1108, and Belder put down the rocking chair and walked away, and Hondros picked up the rocking chair. Turner then went around with Hondros trying to stash the items somewhere. He admitted to that, but maintained not having anything to do with the home invasion homicide. So we can see just how convoluted this court case became between the various lies, retractions, inconsistencies, and probable minimizing of respective roles in this incident among this main cast of characters. Everyone's all like, I said it was this person 3 years ago, but it was really this other person. I told this person I did this, but I was lying then. I'm definitely not lying now. I did help with this, but I didn't help with that. Blah, 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 blah. On top of all that, there was then the lack of physical evidence or any kind of dependable crime scene analytics, given that the crime scene was unsecured for quite a while before the murder was even discovered. It was obvious that the killers had returned to the apartment at some time to clean up because fingerprints had been wiped, and only one bullet from Ruthie Mae's body was recovered and only one casing from the bedroom, which does correspond with Brown's original iteration of events where he said they did go back later to pick up shell casings. The gun itself was determined to be a small semi-automatic, but it was never found. Ruthie Mae's bathroom cabinet was also nowhere to be found, and the cabinet in 1108, by the time detectives got to it, was on the wall and seemed secure, but of course that could have easily been put back in place by then, given the timing. Ruthie Mae's phone also went missing at some point, and who knows who took it and why, but whether it was the murderers themselves or just another random who knew of an apartment full of goodies that were now ripe for the taking, it's clear that there were some comings and goings out of Ruthie Mae's apartment in the immediate aftermath of her murder, and so the crime scene was tainted from the very beginning. And as a result of this very critical lack of credible testimony or physical evidence, Turner's jury rendered a not guilty verdict, and the judge went on to pretty reluctantly issue a not guilty verdict for John Hondros. And during his ruling, he had some pretty scathing things to say about the Chicago Police Department. He made a particular remark that I'll just quote directly, saying that this case was not lost by the state's attorneys. This case was not even lost by the detectives who got the only evidence that they got in a damaged and sanitized crime scene. This case was lost by the patrol division of the Chicago Police Department, who stood by with a deaf ear to the multiple reports of gunshots being fired in 1109. They just couldn't be bothered with the hassle of entering a locked door, so they let them get away with it. Those are some pretty damning words, to be sure, but as a former police officer and as someone who will staunchly defend and support the police whenever it's warranted, there's no way I can really disagree in good faith with anything he said. It is astonishing to me that the responding officers didn't make entry into Ruthie Mae's apartment on the night of the initial call. Initial 3 calls, really. She called in some type of distress, and then there were 2 other calls that came in pointedly reporting gunshots from that specific apartment. And then the initial caller failed to respond to any attempts at contact. The responding officers clearly had an inkling that something was off because they had made comments on the radio along the lines of how someone could be inside 1109 being held hostage, and how they had talked to neighbors who said an old woman lived there who always answered her door. So they seemed to know that something was wrong, and even went so far as to try to use a key to get in. So that does suggest that they were very aware that entering the apartment was the next logical step. Yet when the key didn't work, they just suddenly stopped short of actually forcefully entering, which they could have easily articulated justification for at that point. So it is really peculiar. As someone who worked for a jurisdiction not much different from Chicago and what they deal with, I've answered many a gunshot call, and the majority of them will be from callers who heard what sounded like, and most likely were, gunshots, but they could only really pinpoint it down to, from their perspective, a corner or somewhere in some 100 block. In limited cases, there might actually be a specific premises identified as to where someone might think a gunshot sound came from, but In vague cases like that, it was always a matter of just collecting as much credible information as possible before making any drastic moves or even deciding that there was really nothing to it. But this is really, far from a situation like that. Nothing here was really vague. There were 3 calls the first night, including from the apartment in question, and then, of course, the 2 others on top of that identified that apartment. Then there was Deborah the next day who said, "Hey, my friend comes and sees me on the regular. I didn't see her today, and I'm worried because the police were there last night, etc." So that was a 4th call regarding Ruthie Mae / apartment 1109 in less than 24 hours. But the police still didn't feel enthused enough to force entry. Even if you're inclined to give them the benefit of the doubt for the previous night, at that point the next day it's pretty much impossible to. And that doesn't just fall on the shoulders of the police, by the way. CHA's take was pretty bizarre too, and worrying about getting sued. What would you get sued for? It's your property and a possible emergency. A probable emergency even. If there was a fire or a burst pipe or any kind of other critical scenario along those lines, common sense would dictate to force entry if you can't get in any other way. So it should probably be done when there's an elevated chance that someone's inside dying from gunshot wounds. To be clear though, Ruthie Mae was mortally wounded either way. The medical examiner emphasized in his testimony that even if she had been attended to immediately, she most likely still would have died from all the massive bleeding. But just as the judge alluded to, the next best thing to her life being saved would have been for the crime scene to be immediately secured and not left in the wind, even if inadvertently, to be cleaned up by the perpetrators and trampled on by various characters in their dedicated quest to pilfer the belongings of a murder victim. Who was lying right there? Her body was probably literally stepped over or tiptoed around to get to her stuff, and that's pretty revolting to picture. Were it not for all that, perhaps there would have been more of a fighting chance for Miss Mae's killers to be brought to justice, but as it stands, 2 people were tried and acquitted, and no one's ever been held accountable. This case, as relatively obscure as it is, sparked some interest last year because of a series of TikTok videos a girl made when she discovered a hole in a wall behind her bathroom mirror leading to a vacant apartment on the other side. And that resulted in a slew of references to the Candyman film, and from there, seemingly, people ventured into the Ruthie Mae McCoy rabbit hole. And to that end, I feel like there's something that should be clarified. If you were inclined to research this case for yourself in lieu of listening to some weird random girl, i.e. me, ramble about it, this picture might come up in your search results. It's attached to a couple of podcasts and other YouTubes or whatever that have been made about this case. This person's name is Ruthie Mae McCoy, but this is not the one we just talked about. This woman passed away in 2017 in Georgia at the tender age of 101. And her obituary is online with this picture, and I guess people found it when they Googled the name Ruthie Mae McCoy and mistook this person for the 1987 murder victim. This is not her. I just wanted to set that record straight. And now with that out of the way, that's it for now. See you next time, and be safe.